Hey guys, today I'll show you a supernatural horror film named A Nightmare on Elm Street Part 1. Spoilers ahead, watch out, and take care. The movie begins with a girl named Tina finding herself in a funeral home, not knowing where she was. She could only run in confusion. A stranger's voice called out to her from time to time. She ran into the boiler room where a man suddenly appeared behind her, chasing her after her smell. She heard a few cat cries but saw nothing. Suddenly, the man appeared, embraced her, and scratched her sexy body with his steel claws. Tina woke up realizing it had been a nightmare. She looked down at her abdomen and saw 3 cuts on her pajamas, resembling wounds made by steel claws. She quickly grabbed a crucifix for protection, and the dream reminded her of a nursery rhyme from her childhood. Every child in town knew that the monsters in the rhyme would take their life in dreams. The next morning, Tina told her best friend Nancy about the nightmare. She couldn't sleep all night and felt scared. Nancy comforted her, not taking it too seriously. Later that night, Nancy and her boyfriend came to Tina's house to keep her company, as Tina's mother was leaving for a few days, and Tina didn't dare to sleep alone. As they were chatting on the sofa, Tina mentioned the man with the strange fingers in her dream. Nancy seemed surprised because she had also had a dream the night before. In her dream, there was a man wearing a sweater with fingernails like homemade blades. Tina was shocked by their dream of the same monster. At that moment, Nancy's boyfriend named Depp, the young Captain Jack Sparrow, interrupted their conversation. Before he could say anything, they heard a noise outside. The 2 girls followed closely behind him. Outside, Depp told them to stay back as he ventured into the darkness. He meowed a few times, but got no response. As he was about to speak, a figure suddenly tackled him, but it was Tina's boyfriend, Rod. The 4 of them playfully returned to their rooms one after another. At midnight, Tina was woken up by a knocking sound. She patted Rod, who was sleeping soundly, possibly being suffocated by her strong smell. She then went alone to check the window. Someone was throwing stones at the window and calling her name. At the same time, Nancy was also awakened by a noise. There was a faint shadow on the wall, which disappeared when she got up. She knocked on the wall with her crucifix, thinking she was having a hallucination. Afterward, Tina had already left her house. The silent street was empty and she followed the sound. Suddenly, a metal cover rolled towards her. Tina turned around and saw a man with a hat behind her. The man was short with extremely long arms and a few Wolverine-like blades on his hands. Even with the moonlight behind him, she could see the horrifying scars on his face. Tina turned and ran, but the man caught up with her. She screamed and ran back to the yard. She looked back and saw the man flexing 2 severed fingers with green blood oozing from them. Tina couldn't open the door and was quickly tackled to the ground. Rod was awakened by the screams beside him. Tina was struggling in her nightmare. He lifted the blanket and saw a few bloody marks appearing on her body. Then she flew into the air as if an invisible person was torturing her. Rod watched her fly to the ceiling, then fall and not move again. Nancy came to check, but was locked outside. Depp rushed over and broke the door down. Both were horrified by the gruesome scene. The police quickly arrived at the scene. After an examination, it was determined that Tina had been killed by a sharp weapon, but no weapon was found at the scene. Her boyfriend Rod, with a criminal record, was taken away as a suspect. Nancy's father, the sheriff, was in charge of the case. Nancy hadn't yet recovered from the shock, but she felt her friend's death was related to the nightmare. The next day, Nancy went to school as usual. On the way, she felt uneasy, as if someone was watching her from behind. Just as she looked back, Rod suddenly appeared, embraced her, and fell onto the grassland. He insisted he wouldn't hurt anyone. Nancy asked if he had killed Tina, since the door was locked from the inside and no one knew what had happened. Rod said he hadn't touched Tina, and there was someone else in the room. Seeing Nancy's suspicious gaze, he angrily warned her. Just then, Sheriff appeared with a gun, reminding Rod that he would be fine if he didn't move. Rod ran away but was quickly caught by the police outside. Nancy then realized her father had used her to lure Rod out. She was angry and ignored her father, turning to walk towards the school. Having stayed awake all night, Nancy couldn't help but doze off in class. In her drowsiness, the bloody Tina suddenly appeared at the door. She seemed trapped in a body bag, trying to say something to Nancy. Nancy glanced at her classmates, but no one reacted. When she looked back, there was only a pool of blood on the floor. She left the classroom and saw the body bag had been dragged away, leaving a trail of blood. She called out her friend's name, and an invisible hand dragged the bag around a corner. Nancy chased after the trail, running into a girl with pigtails. As she walked past the girl, a man's voice told her not to run in the hallway. Nancy turned around and the voice came from the pigtailed girl. She ignored the warning and continued chasing. She ended up in the basement, which resembled the funeral home in Tina's dream. A mysterious figure blocked her path, flexing a wound under his clothes. Nancy ran the other way with the man in hot pursuit. Finally, he cornered her, saying she should go to Freddy. Nancy screamed that it was just a nightmare. To wake herself up, she pressed her arm against the hot furnace pipe and woke up with a chicken scream. Her classmates all looked at her and the teacher came to comfort her. After calming down, Nancy left the school alone, finally breaking into tears. It was then that she noticed the burn on her arm, suspecting that the experiences in her dream might be real. She then went to the police station to see Rod and asked about the details of the murder case. Rod was sure that there was someone else in the room, but he couldn't see them. He could only see something on Tina's body, as if 4 blades were cutting her that time. He couldn't explain it all and could only treat it as a dream, just like the nightmare he had a few days ago. In that dream, the strange man had claw-like fingernails. Hearing this, Nancy was terrified. That night, strange events occurred again. Nancy was taking a bath, mumbling the nursery rhyme to herself. As she sang, she fell asleep. A knife-wielding hand slowly emerged from the water. Suddenly, her mother knocked on the door. She woke up and asked what was wrong. Her mother reminded her not to fall asleep in the bathtub, as there was a risk of drowning. Nancy impatiently responded, but fell asleep again after her mother left. Suddenly, it felt like someone was pulling her underwater. She was submerged in an instant. When she surfaced, she screamed for her mother, only to be pulled under again. Her mother heard her cries for help and rushed to knock on the door. Meanwhile, Nancy finally managed to escape and climbed out of the bathtub. Her mother rushed in, and she reassured her mother that she had merely sunk but still felt uneasy. Around midnight, Depp sneaked into Nancy's bedroom earlier because he lived right across the street. Nancy asked if people could dream about things that were about to happen. Depp didn't understand what she meant. Nancy then asked him to be her bodyguard as she wanted to find someone. Soon after, Nancy left the house alone and walked to the nearby police station. She called out Depp's name, and he showed his face to indicate he was still there. Nancy quickly found the cell and looked down through the window. The strange man was indeed looking for Rod. She called out to Depp again but got no response. She watched helplessly as the man easily passed through the iron door and hurriedly shouted for Rod to wake up. The man just looked at her and smiled, then suddenly vanished from her sight. At that moment, Tina's voice came from behind. Nancy turned around to see her friend standing there, waving at her, with centipedes crawling out of her mouth. The ground had also turned into a muddy swamp filled with centipedes. She called for Depp while moving along the wall. The strange man suddenly appeared from behind, startling her into running home. The man followed closely behind. After a long struggle, she finally ran upstairs to find Depp fast asleep. Nancy yelled at the mirror, insisting it was all a dream. The mysterious man suddenly burst out of the mirror and tackled her. The two wrestled their muscles in the room until the alarm clock suddenly went off, and Nancy and Depp finally woke up. She angrily scolded her boyfriend as she had only asked him to stay awake and watch over her, waking her up if she had a nightmare. Now, Nancy knew that the man was going after Rod. Not wanting to waste any time, she immediately rushed to the police station to confirm Rod's safety. However, the on-duty officer refused to let her in. Coincidentally, her father was there. Nancy pleaded with him to let her take a quick look. As they were getting the keys, the bedsheet on Rod's body twisted itself into a rope and moved toward his neck. Rod was quickly awakened by a powerful force. No matter how much he struggled, the rope yanked him off the bed and around the other side of the iron door. When Nancy others arrived, Rod was already hanging in midair, lifeless. Soon after, Nancy and her family attended Rod's funeral. After the funeral, she told her father that the killer was still at large. When Sheriff asked about the killer's identity, Nancy could only describe his appearance. Hearing that, Sheriff changed his expression as if he did know something. However, he said nothing and only asked his wife to keep an eye on their daughter. So the mother took Nancy to a sleep research center. The doctor connected a monitor to Nancy's head, preparing to examine her sleep condition. At first, the data was normal, but as she fell into a deep sleep, the readings soared. Nancy started to struggle in bed, and her mother quickly rushed in to wake her up. To everyone's surprise, there was an inexplicable wound on her body. Moreover, she was clutching a hat, which she claimed to have torn off the man's head. Not long after returning home, Nancy overheard her mother mentioning the hat on the phone. However, when she asked her father if he had investigated, her mother avoided the topic. Nancy knew that there was a psycho killer named Freddy, and she firmly believed that Freddy was after her. Unexpectedly, her mother not only knew about this man, but was also convinced that he was already dead. They had a big quarrel over this, and Nancy stormed out, determined to find a way to protect herself. She stayed out late, studying a book on setting traps. When night fell, she returned home and found that her mother had installed iron bars on all the windows. Nancy confronted her mother and finally got the answer she wanted. It turns out Freddy used to be a bastard who targeted children, killing at least 20 people in the area. The police finally caught him, but due to the prosecutor's negligence, he remained free. To protect their children, angry parents came to the place where he kept the children and burned him alive. That's why her mother firmly believed that Freddy couldn't harm anyone anymore. Nancy trembled as she listened. Since the adults refused to believe her that Freddy was still alive in their nightmares, she decided to deal with Freddy herself, pulling him out of her dreams like she did with the hat. Of course, this plan required Depp's help. They agreed to meet at midnight. As it approached 12 o'clock, Depp accidentally fell asleep in bed. Nancy was waiting for Depp to appear and called him. However, Depp's father didn't want them to date and hung up the phone directly. As Nancy was getting anxious, the phone rang again. Picking it up, she heard nothing but static and was so scared that she tore the phone line apart. However, the phone rang again shortly after. Gathering her courage, Nancy answered it. Freddy whispered, "I'm your boyfriend now." Then his mouth stretched out from the receiver and licked her smelly lips, using his long, snaky tongue. Nancy threw the phone away and stomped on it. Suddenly, she realized that Freddy had gone after Depp. However, her mother had locked the door and refused to open it under any circumstances. At that time, Depp was sound asleep in his bed, snoring like a pig. Suddenly, a ghostly hand with a knife emerged from beneath and pulled him into the bed, leaving only a hormone trace behind. Soon after, a gush of blood sprayed from under the bed. Depp's mother heard the noise and rushed over, only to see blood everywhere. The police quickly arrived at the scene, and the blood had seeped down to the floor below. The scene was horrifying. Nancy saw her father across the street in Depp's house and immediately called her father. Nancy told him she already knew who the killer was. However, when she mentioned Freddy's name, her father refused to believe her. Even so, she asked her father to promise that he would break into her room at 12:30, determined to catch Freddy herself. After hanging up, Sheriff ordered his men to keep an eye on his daughter's room and notify him immediately if anything happened. Meanwhile, Nancy was setting up traps in her home, placing them by her bed and at the door. After coaxing her mother to sleep, she set a 10-minute alarm on her watch and quickly fell asleep. In her dream, she made her way to the warehouse where Freddy was hiding, shouting his nasty name. As she walked into a corner with a fire, Freddy suddenly appeared. She fled, jumped, and landed back in her family's yard. Freddy disappeared again. With only a few seconds left until 12:30, Nancy grew anxious. Suddenly, he appeared to flex his muscles, but she grabbed his muscles tightly, refusing to let go. The alarm went off on time, and Nancy woke up from her dream with no sign of Freddy. Freddy suddenly rushed out from under the bed. Nancy ducked, avoiding the attack, and locked him in her room as she ran out. She then quickly ran to the window and called for her father's help. Sheriff's men shouted that everything was okay, but Nancy cursed and told them to call her father. After that, she ran downstairs to save her shitty life. The man broke through the door and accidentally fell down the stairs, landing right in front of her. The chase continued until Freddy was finally engulfed in flames in the basement. Nancy returned to the door calling for her father, who finally rushed out. The police broke down the door but didn't see Freddy. Nancy suddenly saw a trail of footprints and yelled that he had gone after her mother. They hurried to save her, but when Sheriff arrived, Nancy's mother had already been burned to a crisp. Her charred body vanished before the father and daughter. Nancy told her father to go downstairs first, and when she was alone in the room, Freddy slowly crawled out from the sheets. Nancy knew his weakness. This was just a nightmare. As long as she refused to believe, everything would cease to exist. With that, she turned her back to Freddy and twisted the doorknob. Upon opening the door, Nancy found herself back by her mother's side. Depp and his friends arrived in a car to pick her up for school. Just as she hopped into the car windows suddenly closed on their own. a ghostly hand emerged from behind her mother, hinting that the family was still haunted by the nightmare killer.
A Nightmare on Elm Street, Part 2, Freddy's Revenge. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. The movie begins with a school bus heading to the neighborhood, while two girls were talking about the weird boy sitting in the back. One by one, the other students got off the bus, until only the three of them were left. When the bus reached the girls' stop, the driver drove straight past it without stopping. Ignoring the passengers' displeasure, he sped the bus into the barren desert at the end of the road. After a bumpy ride, the sky suddenly darkened and lightning struck. The bus went faster, eventually coming to a stop after a steep dive. The two girls panicked to pee their pants, pounding on the windows, while the weird boy became more frightened. The ground around them began to collapse, leaving only a few uneven stone pillars standing. The bus balanced precariously between two of the pillars. The driver suddenly transformed into the nightmare killer, Freddy Krueger. The girls scrambled to the weird boy's side, and the three of them huddled together, shivering in fear like chickens. The bus swayed, and Freddy approached them with his razor-sharp claws, stabbing at them as chicken screams filled the air. The scene shifted to a family of four. The little sister heard her older brother Jesse scream and asked her mother why he couldn't wake up as usual. Her mother reassured her that Jesse was just having a nightmare. It turned out that the previous scene was just Jesse's dream. During breakfast, Jesse complained that the room was too hot and he couldn't sleep well. His father thought the air conditioning just needed some maintenance and didn't pay much attention to it. Jesse didn't think there was anything unusual either. However, at school, his friend mentioned that Jesse lived in a large house with iron bars on the windows. The friend sincerely praised Jesse's father for being brave, as everyone in town knew that Nancy, a previous occupant of the same house, was locked in that house by her mother and witnessed her boyfriend across the street being murdered by a nightmare killer. Jesse didn't take these words seriously, but later at midnight, Jesse woke up to get some water from the kitchen window and suddenly saw a figure pass by. He was sure the person was watching him, so he hurried to investigate. The dark yard was empty, but a burst of flame emerged from the basement. Jesse bent down to take a look, and a man wearing a hat was throwing things into the fire. The man seemed unfazed by the heat. Jesse was terrified by that and returned to his house, ready to explore the basement. He opened the door, only to find the man's shadow getting closer. He quickly closed the door and called for his father to help. The creepy man is actually the nightmare killer Freddy, who possessed the ability to teleport. He quickly captured Jesse. However, his goal was not to kill, but to threaten Jesse into assisting him. He removed his hat and peeled back his scalp, flexing his bloody tofu brain to Jesse. Jesse then screamed like a goose and woke up from the nightmare. He thought it was all just a dream, but one night not long after, Jesse's girlfriend, Lisa, came over to help him clean his room. She accidentally found a diary in the corner of his closet that belonged to Nancy, detailing Freddy's pursuit of her. Jesse was unaware of this, but when he saw the description of the steel claws in the diary, he remembered Nancy his friend had mentioned and couldn't help but get panicked. He began to doubt whether the man in his dreams might actually exist. That night, Jesse woke up again from his dreams, drenched in sweat. Turning on the light, he saw that many things in his room had melted from the heat. To confirm his suspicions, Jesse quietly went to the basement and found a steel claw on the floor, the same as the one on Freddy's hand. Suddenly, Freddy appeared, urging him to try on the claw. Then he pressed Jesse's hand onto the hot furnace, threatening him to kill people for him. Jesse turned and ran, but accidentally tripped on some tools behind him. He quickly sobered up and saw that no one was behind him, but the steel claws were indeed lying on the ground. Ever since Jesse's family moved into the house, the temperature inside had been rising. His father thought it was an issue with the air conditioning. While checking the thermostat, the bird cage suddenly shook violently. Jesse lifted the curtain to see a bird die right in front of him. Another bird got startled, bit him, and flew out of the cage, scratching his father's cheek before flying towards his terrified sister. The family was thrown into chaos, and after the bird flew around for a few circles, it exploded into a fireball in midair. After finally cleaning up the mess in the living room, Jesse's father assumed it was a gas leak and prepared to fix it. Jesse thought there was more to it, but when he tried to voice his opinion, his father blamed him for playing pranks on the family with firecrackers. His mother tried to defend him, but Jesse couldn't bear the false accusations and stormed off. Unable to sleep due to the heat, Jesse went downstairs to get some fresh air at midnight. Lightning from outside suddenly pierced through the wall and struck the plates in the kitchen. The recent events were becoming increasingly strange, and Jesse ventured into a nearby bar in the rain. The place was filled with men dressed in eccentric attire. He ordered a beer, but didn't get a chance to drink it before his gym teacher took him back to the school for punishment. After running a few laps in the gym, the teacher told him to go take a shower. However, while Jesse was showering, an incident occurred in the office. The gym teacher was cleaning up the sports equipment when the racket strings on the wall started snapping one by one. Basketballs rolled onto the floor and the shelves around him began to shake violently. Baseballs shot out of a barrel and the teacher dodged them by hitting the ground. The shelves behind him suddenly shifted and the balls on top were flung towards him. A flying barbell shattered the window, and as he was closing the door, a jump rope whipped around him, dragging him into the bathroom and hanging him in front of Jesse. A towel flew over and repeatedly whipped the teacher's backside. Jesse stood there, not daring to move, as hot water gushed out and heavy steam filled the bathroom. Freddie approached the teacher slowly, slashing deep gashes into his body. Jesse reached out his hand to find that he was wearing the glove with steel claws, even covered in the teacher's blood. Jesse screamed in terror. Not long after, the police found a naked Jesse on the street and took him home. His father misunderstood that he had taken something he shouldn't have. The helpless Jesse shook his head and was escorted back to his bedroom by his mother. The next day, Jesse went to school as usual. The school gate was already crowded with people. He had a bad feeling about this. A friend pulled him aside and gossiped that last night a madman had disemboweled the gym teacher like a sausage, leaving bloody footprints all over the bathroom. Jesse could hardly breathe, as Freddie had managed to commit such a crime just by threatening him. That night, Jesse woke up from his nightmare again. Strange noises came from his drawer. When he opened it, the pair of steel claws seemed eager to be worn by him. Jesse heard noises from the room next door. He went over and gently opened the door, only to find his sister saying, "Freddie's coming for you. Better lock your door." Jesse knew that it was Freddie playing tricks and closed the door without engaging. The next morning, he asked his father if he knew about Nancy and why he bought the house. Surprisingly, his father already knew about the incident, but had bought the house due to its low price. Jesse was furious, questioning his father if he knew that the former occupant of the house had gone mad. His sister was frightened by his outburst, and his mother quickly intervened. Just then, the toaster suddenly caught fire. The father hurried to put out the fire, realizing that the appliance was not even plugged in. To figure out what Freddie wanted, Jesse sought Lisa's help. His girlfriend was more meticulous and read about a boiler room in the diary. After researching, they discovered that Freddie had worked at a power plant with a boiler room, so the two drove to the abandoned power plant where Freddie had kidnapped children and killed them. It's said that angry parents had tied him up and burned him alive inside the power plant. After the search, the two found nothing there, and from that day on, Jesse took stimulants every night, afraid to sleep in case Freddie possessed him again. One day, Lisa held a party at home as planned. Seeing that Jesse was constantly restless, she followed him with concern. After comforting him, Jesse gradually regained his composure, and they could not help but kiss each other. Unexpectedly, during the kiss, a long, juicy tongue suddenly stretched out from Jesse's mouth. As Lisa closed her eyes and enjoyed tongue massage, he quickly covered his mouth and ran away. With the party just beginning, Jesse went to his friend's house in despair, revealing the incident with the gym teacher. His friend thought he had just had a nightmare, but seeing Jesse on the verge of collapse, he couldn't just ignore him. He asked what he could do to help. Jesse lay on the couch, asking his friend to watch over him. If he started acting strange, as if he had a nightmare, his friend must stop him from leaving, either by knocking him out or doing anything necessary to keep him from going out. After Jesse fell asleep, his friend lay in bed watching some horror movies from Daniel's CC Movie Channel. Seeing Jesse sleeping like a pig on the sofa, his friend was about to fall asleep when suddenly Jesse woke up in a panic, saying that he felt it happening again. A few seconds later, he became extremely pained, and 4 blades grew out of his fingers. His arm's flesh split apart, gradually turning into the burned Freddie. Terrified, his friend knocked on the door for help, but Freddie quickly broke out from Jesse's skin and stabbed the friend's chick neck with his steel claws. The boy's parents shouted outside the door, and Jesse was now fully awake, with tears streaming down his face, cursing at Freddie in the mirror. Soon after, sirens were heard in the yard, and Jesse escaped through the window. He returned to the party and sought Lisa's help. Seeing her boyfriend covered in blood, Lisa became flustered. Jesse cried, saying that he had just killed his friend and that it was all Freddie's doing. As the two spoke inside the house, the barbecue suddenly caught fire. Everyone thought it was an accident and easily dealt with it, but they didn't know that Freddie had secretly locked the main door. Meanwhile, inside the house, Jesse suddenly yelled at Lisa to get away from there quickly as Freddy was about to arrive. Lisa held Nancy's diary and told him that he must find a way to resist. The surrounding doors and windows automatically locked, and the TV and fish tank suddenly exploded. In a moment of panic, Freddy emerged from Jess's body, and Lisa fled in terror. However, the front door had already been locked. Freddy teleported in front of her, lifted her leg, and viciously bit her. The lights in the yard exploded one by one, and the partygoers couldn't escape through the main door. They gathered on the balcony, banging on the windows. No matter what Lisa tried, she couldn't open the door. In desperation, she held a knife for self-defense. Jesse had already merged with Freddy, and when Lisa finally managed to stab him, the knife felt as soft as cotton. Jess caressed Lisa's face, confessed his love, and then leaped, breaking through the front door. Freddy disappeared with Jesse, and just as everyone thought things had settled down, Freddy burst from the ground, slashing a boy's head with his claws. People scattered in panic, and the iron fence surrounding the yard was hot from the fire. Even the swimming pool was ablaze. Freddy rampaged through the crowd, killing indiscriminately. A brave young man tried to calm him down, but Freddy pushed him to the ground. At that moment, Lisa's father rushed out with a gun. Under everyone's watchful eyes, Freddy was shot, but remained unharmed, possibly because of his bulletproof muscles. He gave Lisa a menacing look before disappearing into the wall. Refusing to let Freddy take Jesse away, Lisa drove to the power plant that night. Two monstrous dogs guarded the entrance, but she closed her eyes and entered. While searching for Freddy, she suddenly felt an unbearable itch on her leg. Looking down, she saw ants crawling all over the wound. Lisa forced herself to stay calm, bandaged the wound, and continued to search the boiler room. The creatures were running around everywhere, frightening her into a frantic run through the plant. Finally shaking off the creatures, Lisa squatted down to catch her breath, only for Freddy to suddenly appear in front of her. She ran, but found herself at a dead end with nowhere to go. Desperate, she called out to Jess's spirit, and Jess responded to his girlfriend, but his voice quickly faded away. Lisa mustered the courage to keep calling for her boyfriend, which gradually weakened Freddy. As he fell, he threatened Lisa, saying they would both die together. But Lisa was resolute and went to tongue massage him, causing Freddy to collapse, unable to move. In a short while, a massive fire engulfed the boiler room, finally knocking Freddy unconscious. The flames quickly disappeared, and Jesse slowly stood up, shedding the skin that belonged to Freddy. The two embraced each other tightly. Not long after, their lives finally returned to normal. Jesse began taking the school bus to school, with Lisa sitting by his side to keep him company. However, the nightmare was not over. As the two were chatting with a friend in the back seat, a steel claw suddenly protruded from the friend's chest, accompanied by Freddy's voice. The school bus accelerated into a desert, indicating that there were more horrors to come. A Nightmare on Elm Street, Part 3, Dream Warriors. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. The movie begins with a young girl named Chris, staying alone in her room doing crafts. She struggled to stay awake, constantly fiddling with glue. The little house made of popsicle sticks was taking shape, with its windows all sealed up, just like the house of Nancy, the main character from the first movie. Finally, her mother returned home and put Chris to bed, urging her to sleep. After saying goodnight, Chris fell asleep, but soon she was awakened by a cold breeze. She got up and saw the gloomy house standing behind her. A child was jumping at the door, humming the familiar nursery rhyme, "Freddy is coming for you. You better lock your door, grab your crucifix, and stay awake." Chris approached the door, and a little girl on the bike greeted her. Before they could exchange many words, a noise came from a distance. The girl turned her head and went into the house. Worried about her safety, Chris hurriedly followed. Inside, it was dark. She went down to the basement, where the little girl rode her bike towards her, telling her this was the place where Freddy brought them. It seemed to be the boiler room, where he kept the kidnapped children. However, the outside of the house looked just like Nancy's home. As Chris was about to take the girl and leave, the furnace behind them suddenly ignited with blazing flames. She picked up the girl and rushed out, but before she could escape the basement, the floor turned into a swamp. The moment Freddy caught up, Chris pulled her feet out and ran upstairs. She then collided with a corpse. Looking around, the room was filled with corpses, all killed by Freddy. The girl asked Chris to put her down, and when she looked down, the girl had turned into a skeleton. Chris suddenly woke up from the nightmare. After gaining senses, she went to wash her face. Suddenly, the faucet clamped her hand, and Freddy appeared in the mirror to flex his demonic figure. The other faucet turned into a steel claw and stabbed her, causing her to scream in a chicken voice. Her mother burst through the door to check where the chicken was, but Chris woke up again. Although everything had happened in her dream, it looked as if she had cut herself. The scene shifts to the town's hospital, where many teenagers plagued by nightmares have been admitted recently. Neil, the head of the psychiatric department, first met Chris when the girl was going berserk in the examination room, even injuring a nurse. Neil tried to calm her down, but she kept holding a scalpel, crying and singing Freddy's nursery rhyme, not letting anyone approach her. Unexpectedly, when the new intern, Nancy, arrived and continued singing the rhyme, Chris put down the knife and embraced her because the two shared similar experiences. It turns out Nancy was the only survivor of the Freddy incident, and after 7 years, she was now a medical graduate student, making breakthrough research on nightmares at a young age. The health department specifically assigned her to assist the doctors. After things temporarily settled down, Neil asked Nancy about the nursery rhyme. Perhaps due to her bizarre experience, Nancy didn't reveal the truth. Neil noticed Nancy taking a medication called dream suppressant. He looked it up online and found that this experimental drug had the effect of suppressing dreams. The next day, Nancy was assigned to the group therapy area, where the children residing there suffered from nightmares and had a history of self-harm. That night, Chris was alone in her room, drawing, but she fell asleep due to her lack of rest. Soon, a small tricycle, smeared with blood, entered the room, but the little girl was nowhere to be seen. Chris was alarmed and quickly left, sticking to the wall. The tricycle seemed to have been exposed to extreme heat, melting before her eyes. Piercing wails filled the air, and Chris was petrified. The door in front of her suddenly closed, trapping her inside the house. On the dining table on the first floor, there was a roast piglet. The girl stared at her without moving, and the piglet suddenly stood up and screamed, scaring her into running upstairs. The carpet was soaked with blood, and a huge creature pierced through the floor and burrowed into the wall. Chris screamed and stared at it without letting her guard down. The creature circled around and suddenly disappeared. As she nervously scanned the room, a giant snake emerged from under her feet, knocking her to the ground. With its mouth wide open, it prepared to swallow her whole, including her smelly part. In panic, Chris screamed Nancy's name. On the other side, Nancy woke up instantly. She looked at the toy house she had brought from Chris' home, as if she could hear the girl calling her. Suddenly, a wave of dizziness struck, and she fell into the chair, landing directly into Chris' dream. The giant snake was about to swallow Chris when Nancy picked up a shard of glass and stabbed it fiercely. Chris was finally saved. As the snake rose, Freddy's face was revealed. Recognizing Nancy, she instructed Chris to take her out. The girl covered her head, and both of them returned to reality. The next day, Nancy found Chris while holding the small toy house and asked if she had ever brought others into her dreams before. It turned out that this was not the first time Chris had done this. Since she was 3 years old, she would bring her father into her dreams to protect herself. Her father always thought he was dreaming, and after her parents divorced, she never tried it again. During the group therapy time, the doctor gathered all the teenagers together, believing they were suffering from mass hysteria. However, it can't explain why these children dreamed of the same killer even before they met each other. In the therapy session, a female doctor suggested that their abnormal behavior stemmed from psychological trauma or moral conflict. But the teenagers had long lost hope in the doctors and had their own methods to resist the nightmares. Every night, the wheelchair-bound boy and the mute boy in the same room would take turns staying awake. If the sleeping person made any movement, the one on watch would wake them up immediately. The arrival of Chris and Nancy once again provoked Freddy's attacks. He possessed a boy's doll, and when the boy woke up from his dream, Freddy was already approaching him. He severed the boy's tendons, treating him like a marionette, and led him out of the room. The roommate couldn't see the scene in his dream and assumed the boy was sleepwalking, glancing at him and falling back asleep. After Freddy had his fill playing with the boy on the rooftop, he cut all 4 tendons, and the boy fell, never waking up again. After the incident, the doctors gathered everyone together again. They still insisted that it was a case of self-termination and refused to listen to the children's protests. The female doctor insisted on prescribing sleeping pills for them. Fortunately, the day before, Nancy had talked to Neil, and although he didn't understand what was going on, he chose to believe Nancy and prescribed the children the dream suppressant medication instead. The next night, the girl, who had always dreamed of being an actress, was afraid to sleep and insisted on staying up all night in the TV room. Given the accident that had occurred in the hospital the night before, the caregiver reluctantly let her stay. Unexpectedly, after the girl had dozed off a few times, Freddy's shadow suddenly appeared on the TV screen, followed by a scrambled picture. The girl tried changing channels, but to no avail. As she raised her hand to hit the TV, Freddy's claws violently burst from the casing, his head also emerging through the plastic, and he shoved the girl into the screen like an adult toy. Not long after, Neil attended the girl's funeral, unable to comprehend what had happened to these children. As he mourned, a nun suddenly appeared beside him. The nun introduced herself and told Neil that to save the children, the restless spirit must be laid to rest. Neil was confused, and before he could ask more, Nancy came over. When he looked back, the nun had disappeared. After spending some time together, Nancy and Neil grew closer. With two people now lost to the hospital, Nancy finally revealed the truth. She then introduced the children to Freddy's identity. Moreover, Nancy was convinced that these kids in the room were the last descendants of the parents who had burned Freddy alive. That's why Freddy came here to seek revenge. Nancy took the children into Chris' dreamscape. They were delighted to discover that they had extraordinary abilities in their dreams. Unbeknownst to everyone, a person was missing from the group. The mute boy had secretly admired a nurse for a long time, and today she invited him to play with her. The boy didn't expect that and happily accepted her kiss. Little did he know, as they tongue massaged each other, the nurse's tongue grew longer and snaky. She spat out 2 long tongues, tying the boy to the bed. When Freddy materialized, the area under the bed had transformed into a large pit of fire, with intense flames scorching the boy. Chris could sense that Freddy was nearby. It was then that Neil noticed the mute boy was missing. He wanted to go out and save him, but the doorknob was burning hot, and even the walls began to emit heat. Just as the room seemed about to be engulfed in flames, the female doctor forcefully opened the door and woke everyone up. The mute boy lay motionless on the ground, trapped in a deep coma and unable to wake up. As they were at a loss for what to do, Neil happened to see the nun standing on the attic balcony, looking around. He shouted out to her, but she didn't respond. He ran up to see what was going on, and it seemed as if the nun was waiting for him. After seeing Neil, she revealed the truth behind everything. It's revealed that this building had been abandoned for a long time, and this room was the source of the evil. A long time ago, a young female worker was accidentally locked in here, and the patients hit her, repeatedly assaulting her. By the time people discovered the woman, she was on the brink of death, and she was pregnant with a child, Freddy. He inherited the genes of assaulting madmen, which was why he was so crazed. The nun told Neil that the only way to deal with Freddy was to take his remains to a sacred place for cremation. After saying this, the nun disappeared. At this moment, Nancy asked Freddy to let the mute boy go, but Freddy not only heard her, but he also wrote a message on the boy's body, challenging her to save the boy. That night, Neil sought Nancy's help. In the past, Nancy's father had participated in the event of burning Freddy, and only he knew the whereabouts of the remains. However, when the two found him at a bar, the man was unwilling to disclose the location. He had lost his wife because of this man, and didn't want to get involved again. Just then, Neil received a call from the hospital. Chris had lost control of her emotions, and was locked in an isolation room by the female doctor, who had injected her with a sedative. The children feared that Freddy would take advantage of the situation and could only seek Neil's help. Neil asked Nancy to save the others, while he went to find the remains. The two decided to split up and act separately. Neil confronted Nancy's father, demanding he take him to find the remains. As they passed a church, Neil secretly took a bottle of holy water and a crucifix. Soon after, Nancy's father led Neil to an abandoned car factory, knowing the remains were there, but not the exact location. Meanwhile, Nancy returned to the hospital. The nursing staff wouldn't allow her to see Chris in the isolation room, so she made the excuse of saying goodbye to the children and gathered the remaining ones together. Under her guidance, the children imagined themselves in the isolation room and fell into a deep sleep one after another. Chris seemed to have a premonition and met with her companions in their shared dream. Before they could rejoice, Freddy's steel claws suddenly appeared, slashing back and forth, and feathers filled the room. The children couldn't see each other and screamed for Nancy's help. In a daze, Chris suddenly found herself back in the same scene and dialogue from the night she first saw Freddy. Her mother's new boyfriend was heard from downstairs, and Chris pleaded with her mother not to leave her. As her words fell, her mother was yanked out of the doorway, and Freddy emerged, slashing off the woman's head with one swipe. He dangled the trophy in front of Chris, who backed away in panic, and then jumped out of the window. She then shouted for Nancy in despair. The scene shifted to another girl, who became a bad girl in her dream as she had wished. Armed with 2 knives, she anxiously awaited Freddy's appearance. Soon, Freddy appeared in black, and the girl took the first move, quickly cornering him. Unexpectedly, Freddy's hands suddenly turned into several needles and jabbed at her arms. Elsewhere, the boy in the wheelchair was no longer paralyzed in his dream. He shouted the names of his companions, and Freddy knocked him down with the wheelchair. As he lay on the ground, he suddenly remembered that he was a wizard in his dream, so he chanted a spell and sent a light wave towards Freddy. However, as he rushed over, Freddy grabbed him in midair. Freddy claimed he didn't believe in fairy tales and quickly finished off the boy. Meanwhile, Chris met up with Nancy and another companion. The 3 couldn't summon Freddy, no matter how hard they tried. Just as they were unsure what to do, an iron door appeared before them, with the familiar boiler room behind it. Flames flickered beneath the staircase, and they ventured down together, finally finding the mute boy on the lowest level. Freddy, crazed and showing off his prey, slit the boy's tongue and threw him in. Fortunately, Nancy was quick to react, grabbing the boy's hands while her companion helped her save him. Seeing that Freddy was about to hurt Chris, the other companion drew a steel rod to stab him. Everyone thought Freddy would disappear, but instead, he slowly pulled out the rod, seemingly unharmed. He lifted his shirt to reveal several faces on his stomach, boasting that these victims made him stronger. The scene shifted to the abandoned car factory, where Nancy's father led Neil to Freddy's old car. Neil pried open the hood and found the remains as he had hoped. Before they could take it away, the car suddenly started, and Freddy's skeleton ran out, charging straight at Neil. Nancy's father charged at the skeleton with a pitchfork, but was instead lifted by the skeleton and impaled on an iron rack behind him. From a distance, Neil screamed in horror as the skeleton knocked him down with a few blows, and then with a sinister laugh, it dispersed into a pile of bones. On the other hand, Nancy and the others were trapped in a room full of mirrors. The mute boy, witnessing his friends being dragged into the mirrors, finally shouted "No" angrily, which surprisingly caused Freddy to vanish temporarily. The group embraced each other in celebration. Nancy's father suddenly appeared at the door, having crossed boundaries just to apologize to his daughter. After so many years, the father and daughter finally reconciled, and Nancy tightly hugged her dad. Unbeknownst to her, the person in her arms turned into Freddy and stabbed her with a knife. Accompanied by Nancy's wails, Neil woke up from his unconscious state. Calling Nancy's name, he struggled to crawl out of a deep pit and pushed Freddy's skeleton into it. As he sprinkled holy water, Freddy disappeared on the other side as well. Holding Nancy's lifeless body, Chris wept in tears, unable to bring her back. The story concluded at Nancy's funeral. In a daze, Neil felt the presence of the nun once again. Following his intuition, he discovered the nun's gravestone, which surprisingly bore the name of Freddy's mother. It turned out that she had guided Neil to defeat her psycho son, Freddy. As Neil slept, a light suddenly lit up in the toy house, indicating that Freddy hadn't completely vanished. A Nightmare on Elm Street, Part 4, The Dream Master. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. In the previous movie, the nightmare killer Freddy finally got rid of his favorite target Nancy, and he was seemingly purified. However, the girl named Chris, who was gifted with the power to pull others into her nightmares, cannot enjoy her peaceful life for long before she experiences another nightmare. This time, she dreams of the old house where Freddy lived before his death. A little girl is drawing the house on the ground outside the front door and tells Chris that Freddy is not home. Soon after, Chris is taken inside the house. In the dream, she witnesses various metaphors and illusions, which frightens her greatly. In her fear, she pulls the other 2 survivors from the previous movie, Lucky Guy and Timid Boy, into her dream. The 3 of them are in the boiler room of the dream, but they don't find Freddy. Eventually, they discover that Lucky Guy's dog has also been pulled into the dream by Chris. The dog bites Chris's arm, and the 3 of them wake up in shock. Upon waking, Lucky Guy finds blood in his dog's mouth, and Chris discovers bite marks on her arm. The next day, the 3 meet at school, and Lucky Guy and Timid Boy complain that Chris's anxiety has dragged them into her dream. They tell her not to be so suspicious and paranoid in the future, or else they might accidentally wake Freddy up. Their conversation ends on a sour note. Chris has a lively boyfriend named Rick, and Rick's sister named Alice, who often shares her dream experiences with Chris. Chris's other friends include an asthmatic girl with glasses and an athletic girl who hates insects. Life seems peaceful, but unbeknownst to Chris, Freddy has returned and is plotting revenge on them. The first victim is Lucky Guy, not lucky enough this time. In his dream at night, he is pulled into a junkyard, where Freddy's remains are buried and witnesses Freddy's rebirth. Afterward, Freddy uses his powers to trap Lucky Guy in the dream. Realizing he has no hope of escape, Lucky Guy issues a final warning. The second victim is Timid Boy. Freddy uses the same trick as last time, causing him to have another erotic dream. He thinks he can have some hormone yoga with a flirty girl, but the girl suddenly turns into Freddy. The waterbed turns into a pool, causing him to drown. The next day, Chris arrives at school and finds that Lucky Guy and Timid Boy are gone. She panics, knowing that Freddy has returned. Rick comforts her using his words, but not muscles, but she accidentally knocks herself unconscious. In her unconscious state, she meets Freddy, who is disguised as a female doctor. Fortunately, the school nurse revives her just in time to avoid danger. Afterward, Chris brings Rick, Alice, and Alice's boyfriend Jordan to Freddy's old house to search for clues, hoping to find a way to end their nightmares once and for all. Before they can enter, Chris encounters her mother and is forcibly taken home. Chris soon finds herself feeling drowsy as her mother has slipped her sleeping pills. The mother believes that Chris is acting out in teenage rebellion, pretending to be crazy and not sleeping to attract attention. Due to the sleeping pills, Chris enters the nightmare very soon. In her dream, Chris finds herself on a sunny beach. However, Freddy's claws emerge from the ground and chase her after her smell. The sand starts to sink, and Freddy appears to flex his demonic figure, pushing her into the boiler room. Freddy taunts her with words and threatens that she can call more people to help herself. Chris knows that Freddy hasn't pulled anyone other than the Elm Street descendants into their dreams, but in her desperation, she can't control her powers and accidentally pulls Alice into the nightmare. In the end, Chris can't escape Freddy's grasp and is pushed into the furnace. Before she dies, she transfers her dream-pulling ability to Alice and helps her escape. But now, Alice has become Freddy's target. When Alice wakes up, she immediately takes her brother to Chris's house, only to find a burned corpse and flames. Meanwhile, her close friends begin to encounter misfortune one after another. The first victim is Alice's friend, the asthmatic girl. She is answering questions in class when suddenly words appear on the paper and the pen drips blood. Freddy crawls out of the exam paper. As the asthmatic girl has asthma, Freddy sucks the breath and hormones out of her in a French-style kiss in the nightmare. In reality, the girl has an asthma attack, and even using her inhaler doesn't save her shitty life. Next to be killed is Alice's brother and Chris's boyfriend, Rick. Rick is a fan of ninja culture, so Freddy prepares a Japanese-style dream scenario. Due to his usual practice, Rick manages to kick the invisible Freddy. However, just as he is celebrating, the bladed glove suddenly moves and kills him. With her friends and loved ones dying one by one, Alice is deeply depressed. Her father, grieving over his son's death, becomes overprotective of her and doesn't allow her to leave the house. Depressed, Alice sneaks out to the movie theater, hoping that watching a Daniel C.C. horror movie will help improve her mood. However, strange things start happening as she gets pulled into the screen, finding herself in the dream world. Alice ends up at the pizzeria where she works, only to see an older version of herself still working as a waitress amidst a scene of decay. Freddy appears to flex his demonic figure again and explains his plan to Alice. Originally, his killing spree was supposed to end after Chris's death, as she was the last descendant of the people on Elm Street. But before she died, Chris transferred part of her special power to Alice, thus connecting her to Freddy, causing the nightmare killer to be able to enter and exit her dreams freely. Freddy reveals that he didn't kill Alice because people instinctively think of their loved ones when in danger. So by constantly scaring Alice in her dreams, she will unwittingly pull more people into her nightmares. Unknowingly, Alice becomes Freddy's servant, serving him one delicious soul pizza after another. Upon hearing Freddy's explanation, Alice becomes worried about her friend and subconsciously pulls her friend, the athletic girl, into the dream. Cunning Freddy then drives Alice out of the nightmare. Awake, Alice immediately finds her boyfriend, Jordan, and drives to the athletic girl's house to save her. Unfortunately, Freddy has already succeeded in killing her, even though she's good at running. Since the girl fears bugs, Freddy transforms her body, bit by bit, into a cockroach. After some teasing, he locks the cockroach-transformed girl in a roach motel and crushes her. Freddy then uses illusions to make the cummy Alice and Jordan trapped in a dimension, appearing in the middle of the road but with no way out. Alice steps on the gas, trying to run over Freddy, but they end up in a car accident instead. Alice suffers minor injuries, while Jordan is rushed to the hospital for surgery due to damaged organs. However, once he's sedated, he'll fall asleep and fall into Freddy's grasp. To protect her boyfriend, Alice decides to face Freddy directly. She discovers she can inherit the abilities of her deceased friends. So she returns home, arms herself with the mementos of her friends: Rick's headband, the bug repellent made by the asthmatic girl, and the wrist guard given by the athletic girl. She prepares to face Freddy, bringing these bonds and abilities into a battle to the death. She then takes sleeping pills to enter the dream world and protect her boyfriend. In the nightmare, Jordan opens his eyes to see Freddy, but Alice arrives just in time to help him escape. The two of them tumble and fall in a seemingly barrel-like corridor, landing on the ground. Jordan notices he's bleeding from his chest, and the doctors in the operating room see it too. They wake Jordan from anesthesia, while Alice is left alone in the dream world's church. Alice somersaults in front of Freddy, punching and kicking his smelly parts, but he remains unharmed and laughs like a psycho. By now, Freddy has absorbed too many souls and fears from his victims, making him grow stronger. So those attacks don't work on him at all. At this moment, Alice gets a clue from a nursery rhyme sung by the souls of the children. Evil will see itself, and it will die. So Alice uses a broken mirror to reflect Freddy's image, and in an instant, the trapped souls within him start to retaliate. They crawl out of Freddy's body, causing him to explode and be defeated once again. The trapped souls of the victims thank Alice before ascending to heaven to meet Jesus. In the end, the street finally returns to peace. Alice and a recovered Jordan make a wish by tossing coins into the hospital pool. For a moment, Alice sees Freddy's reflection, but she is no longer afraid of the nightmare killer. Calmly, she begins her new life and embraces her honey days with her boyfriend. A Nightmare on Elm Street, Part 5, The Dream Child. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. The movie begins with Alice and her boyfriend Dan having been living a peaceful life after Alice defeated the nightmare killer Freddy in the previous episode. However, their happiness is short-lived as Alice once again falls into a dream state. In her dream, she takes on the persona of a nun named Amanda, who is actually Freddy's mother. She then finds herself in a mental institution where the male patients start assaulting her. It's revealed that Amanda was violated by a group of maniacs, which resulted in her giving birth to a monstrous child, Freddy. However, Alice is unaware of Freddy's origin and wakes up in a panic. Despite her concerns, Alice attends her graduation ceremony at school and shares her nightmare with Dan. He tries to reassure her that as long as she doesn't dream about Freddy, everything will be okay. But as we all know, things are never that simple. That night, Alice dreams about the nursery rhyme and the skipping children from previous films, and finds herself back in the mental institution, witnessing the birth of Freddy. She also witnesses his transformation into a grotesque and hideous creature. As she tries to process what she has just seen, everyone in the operating room disappears, and she finds herself in a church, where Amanda tells her that Freddy has summoned her to be reborn. To stop the demon from killing again, Alice must find Amanda at the top of the tower in the mental institution. Alice was awakened by her colleague at the convenience store, where she was working. It was strange that Alice hadn't fallen into a deep sleep just now, but was pulled into a dream by Freddy while standing. It seemed that Freddy had returned and become even more powerful this time. Even if she remained conscious, Alice could be dragged into the nightmares. Alice quickly called Dan to tell him that Freddy had resurrected. Worried about her safety, Dan hurried to her location. However, an accident occurred on the way. Freddy was mischievously drinking alcohol in the passenger seat, and Dan was thrown out of the car. Dan found another motorcycle and started to speed on the highway. As a result, his body gradually merged with the motorcycle, becoming a low-budget version of the Ghost Rider. Alice seemed to sense something sinister and saw in a flash of an image that Dan's soul was being absorbed by Freddy's body. Alice had a bad feeling and hurried to the door. As expected, Dan had an accident and its car was severely damaged and engulfed in flames. Looking at Dan's bloody body, Alice was saddened. Suddenly, Freddy possessed Dan's body and taunted Alice, asking her if she wanted to have his child. Overwhelmed by the fright, Alice fainted. When she woke up, she was already lying in a hospital bed. Alice told her father that Freddy had killed Dan, but no one believed her bullshit. The police found beer bottle fragments in the car and determined that Dan had caused the accident due to drunk driving. What's worse, Alice learned from the doctor that she was already pregnant and the child's father was Dan. At night, Alice met a little boy named Jacob who said he was lonely and regretted Dan's death. He came just to make sure Alice was okay. Jacob's words surprised Alice, making her wonder how he knew all this. But Jacob didn't answer and left. On the day of her discharge, Alice asked the intern girl at the hospital if she knew Jacob. However, she told her that there were no children among the patients on the same floor, and there was no children's ward in the hospital. Alice must have been too tired and saw it wrong. After returning home, Alice told the story of Freddy's origins to her friend Greta and her boyfriend Mark, a comic fan. However, like everyone else, the three of them didn't believe that the nightmare really existed. However, the nightmare came faster than expected to Alice's friends. The first to suffer was Greta. While everyone was chatting and laughing at the family banquet, Greta was feeling down because her good friend Dan had left. She had no appetite, but didn't expect that just by closing her eyes for a moment, she was dragged into a dream by Freddy. In the dream, her mother became unusually strict and forced Greta to eat quickly, otherwise the guest would be unhappy. Greta spoke out of turn, but before she could finish, Freddy transformed into a chef and forcefully stuffed food into her mouth. Finally, amidst the laughter of the guests, Greta was fed like a goose and turned into a big-mouthed frog. Meanwhile, strange things were also happening with Alice. When she opened the bottles and cans in the fridge, they began to deform, moss started to grow, and even eyeballs appeared in the food. Suddenly, Greta appeared in the fridge, and Alice tried to pull her out, but failed. Greta was still dragged back by Freddy and sent to meet Jesus in front of everyone's eyes. Greta's mysterious death made intern girls start to believe that everything Alice said was true. The two of them found Mark's warehouse and discussed the incident. However, intern girl had to leave early for the hospital night shift, leaving Alice to console Mark and continue to discuss how to deal with Freddy. Just as Alice turned around to pour coffee, Freddy targeted Mark. There was a picture of a cabin on the table, and when Alice saw Mark appear in front of the painted house, she was worried. In despair, Alice drew herself onto the picture as well, and the next second she found herself in the same dream world. She heard Mark's cry for help from underground and rushed to him just in time to pull him up as he was about to fall into a bottomless abyss. They ran out as fast as Tesla bikes, but Mark fainted when he saw the blood in his hand and was saved from danger by this coincidence. At this point, the door behind Alice closed automatically, and the little boy Jacob appeared again. Alice asked him why he was here alone and told him to go home or his mother would worry. In response to her concern, Jacob said he had been having nightmares about his mother rejecting him and asked Alice why she didn't like him. It turned out that Jacob was actually Alice's unborn child. Back to reality, worried about the child's safety, Mark sent Alice to the hospital for a prenatal checkup. With intern girl's help, Alice was able to make an appointment with the doctor smoothly. She finally understood why Freddy was able to bypass her dream and directly kill people. It turns out babies can also dream before they are born, and they spend most of their time in a dreaming state. Therefore, Freddy enters the baby's dream instead. Moreover, he feeds on children by absorbing their souls. Alice must find a way to stop all this. Otherwise, the child she gives birth to will undoubtedly become a monster like Freddy. Mark tried to persuade Alice to abort the child, but she refused and insisted on having the child. After that, Mark went to investigate the identity of Amanda and to clarify what she had said to Alice. He found some old newspapers about Amanda. Unlike Alice's dream, Amanda did not die during Freddy's birth, but rather ended her own life by hanging after Freddy's arrest due to his killings. However, Amanda's body was missing, and her grave was likely just an empty tomb. Mark had read in the Bible that if believers end their lives, their soul will suffer. In other words, to defeat Freddy, they must find Amanda's body and release her suffering soul. In order to find Amanda's hidden corpse as soon as possible, Alice decided to meet her in her dream. Before the mission, she reminded Mark to stay awake and keep an eye on her. Unexpectedly, during this time, intern girl found herself in danger. She was just about to dive when the pedal beneath her suddenly cracked and transformed into steel claws. She leaped into the air and fell directly into a dream. Freddy grabbed her by her hair to intimidate Alice, but Alice took a metal rod and pierced Freddy's throat, which only helped intern girl escape but caused no harm to Freddy. Meanwhile, Mark was lying on the ground reading comics. Suddenly, all the stories turned into Freddy's stories, including Dan and Greta's death. Even the moment when Mark was lying on the ground appeared in the comic. Shocked, Mark was sucked into the comic book, and everything around him turned gray, except for himself. Freddy didn't attack him immediately, but played hide and seek with him. He first destroyed the shelves, and then scared him with the dead Greta. Mark couldn't take it anymore, so he used his imagination in the comic world, and armed himself as a ninja with guns in hand. He fired bullets at Freddy without fear, and as Freddy fell to the ground, Mark thought he had succeeded. But as he turned around, Freddy resurrected in his super form, and Mark became a paper man. Freddy tore him into pieces, and Mark faded away. As her friends kept getting into trouble, Alice's father worried and stayed close to her. With no other options, Alice asked Intern Girl to search for Amanda's body in the tower, and then she went into the dream to distract Freddy in order to buy Intern Girl more time. In the dream, Alice pushed Freddy into the midst of the mentally ill patients, and in the blink of an eye, he was torn apart by the group of patients. Then, his torn in pieces body was scattered away. But not long after, Freddy appeared again to flex his monstrous figure. He then changed his tactics and deceived the little boy Jacob into thinking he was his next generation. Under Freddy's sweet words, Jacob had already considered him a friend. But Alice tried to help Jacob get rid of Fred's deception. Upon hearing Alice's call, Jacob didn't hesitate to run into her embrace. In order to prevent the mother and son reunion, Freddy twisted time and space and even turned into Dan to tempt Jacob. Fortunately, Alice saw through Freddy's trick. Just when the mother and son were finally hugging each other, Freddy actually squeezed out of Alice's body, leaving only fear and chaos behind. On the other side, after a search on the high tower, Intern Girl managed to find Amanda's corpse. The eerie moonlight, coupled with the pigeons flying around, made Intern Girl tremble in fear. But she still summoned up the courage to approach the corpse. Surprisingly, when Intern Girl approached, Amanda's body disappeared in an instant, and her soul was finally free. Alice was still fiercely struggling with Freddy. After Amanda appeared here, everyone thought she would land her final blow to destroy Freddy. However, Amanda told Jacob that his mother couldn't defeat Freddy alone, and now only he could help her. Triggered by her words, Jacob turned into a demon-like figure and played with Freddy. Freddy probably regretted feeding him so many souls previously. Just then, Jacob extended his long, juicy tongue, not only pierced Freddy's body, but also released the trapped souls inside. After the final blow, Freddy and Jacob both transformed back into baby forms. What Alice and Amanda had to do next was to put their respective children back into their stomachs. After completing the task, Amanda urged Alice to leave quickly, and she would seal Freddy somewhere. But just when they reached the door, Freddy's claws broke through out of his mother's body. But it remains unknown whether Amanda could control her ghost baby or not. In the end, Alice gave birth to her child safely. For young Jacob, the terrifying experience might just be a dream. A Nightmare on Elm Street, Part 6, Freddy's Dead, The Final Nightmare. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. The film begins with a quote from the philosopher Nietzsche, followed by a report on a major news event. In the town of Springwood, where Freddy resides, all teenagers have died from unknown murders. Only one young man survived, and although he managed to escape Springwood, he is still tormented by Freddy's nightmares. In his dreams, the only survivor, John, first experiences a doomed flight, falling from a chair in the sky into a house, only to open the window and find himself in another adventure. A sinister laugh echoes, and Freddy appears dressed as Harry Potter, knocking John out of the dream by having him struck by a speeding bus. John hits his head on a rock, loses his memory, and wanders into a strange town. A patrolling police officer takes him to the local juvenile correction center. Maggie, a psychologist at the center, discovers that John has lost most of his memory and only remembers being a survivor. This causes him to be afraid to sleep, so she arranges for him to stay at the center. In John's belongings, Maggie finds a brief on Freddy's wife, which seems to awaken some memories for her. That night, Maggie dreams of a young girl playing with her father in Springwood. At the same time, John dreams of the same girl and follows her guidance to find his lost memories. The next day, during a counseling session, John tells Maggie about his dream and describes the girl's appearance. To her surprise, Maggie realizes she dreamt of the same girl. Puzzled, she consults her doctor colleague, who is a psychologist specializing in dream research and is currently studying the legendary dream demons. These demons find the most evil beings in the human world and grant them the power to make nightmares a reality. After their conversation, Doctor tells Maggie that she has unconsciously hidden some memories she doesn't want to face. He suggests she take John back to Springwood to uncover the buried truth. Despite John's strong resistance to returning to Springwood, Maggie takes him on the journey to unravel the mystery. As they drive, John hallucinates the little girl in front of them, nearly causing a car accident. They discover that 3 teenagers from the correction center have stowed away in the car. These 3 are Spencer, a wealthy heir addicted to video games and drugs, Carlos, who wears a hearing aid after his mother damaged his ear, and Tracy, an aggressive young woman who has suffered abuse from her father. Maggie decides they will all go to Springwood together, then have the three teenagers drive back to the correction center afterward. Unwary, the group enters the Nightmare's lair in Springwood. Upon arrival, they find the town just as the news reported. Not a single teenager remains, and the remaining adults are all insane and exhibit bizarre behavior. Spencer tries to contact Doctor, but finds communication is impossible due to a malfunction. A crazed middle-aged woman clings to the three teenagers, vowing to protect them this time and not let any more children be taken away. The bell at the town's school suddenly rings, causing the deranged townspeople to scatter in fear. Three bewildered individuals decide to head back to the correction center, while Maggie and John go to the school to look for clues. Upon arriving at the school, the two meet a peculiar teacher who has been researching Freddy, as evidenced by the information about Freddy written all over the blackboard. Maggie discovers that the report John has been carrying with him was taken from a book in the teacher's collection. The teacher then tells them that Freddy had a child who was sent to the orphanage in town. Maggie and John immediately head to the orphanage in search of clues. Meanwhile, the trio of Spence, Carlos, and Tracy are driving in circles, unable to escape the town. As night falls, they decide to spend the night at a seemingly neat and tidy house for sale. Once they enter, the house reveals its true nature as the terrifying Elm Street. Unwittingly, they have fallen into Freddy's grasp. Carlos, claiming to be exhausted, decides to find a bed and sleep, while Spence and Tracy search for a bathroom. However, Carlos quickly becomes Freddy's appetizer. In his nightmare, Carlos finds himself in a hallway where Freddy disguises himself as Carlos' abusive mother, violently piercing his ears and taking away his hearing aid. Desperate to regain his hearing aid, Carlos follows Freddy, who then transforms into a hearing aid on the floor. After putting it on, Carlos' hearing becomes incredibly sensitive, and even the sound of a needle dropping is deafening. Freddy torments him by dropping a pile of needles and then scraping his metal claws against a chalkboard. Unable to bear the noise, Carlos' head explodes into mashed potato. Tracy soon discovers Carlos' disappearance and calls for Spence to leave, but Spence refuses to go after being hallucinated by the drugs. Tracy sets off alone to find help. Meanwhile, Maggie and John encounter a strange old man at the orphanage who seems to recognize them and tells them John's origin. With his amnesia, John believes the old man's words that he might be Freddy's child, which would explain why he could escape from Springwood. But Maggie dismisses the old man's dying bullshit. As they leave the orphanage, they run into Tracy, and the three rush back to Elm Street to save their friends. By the time they arrive, Spence has already been dragged into a nightmare, becoming a character in Freddy's video game. In the game, Spence falls down a sewer pipe and is beaten by a character resembling his father. After eating an apple beneath a tree, he transforms into Super Spence and defeats the monster with missiles. However, he is soon chased by a Freddy-shaped monster. In the real world, John and Tracy enter the dream again to save Spence, stealing Freddy's game controller. Unfortunately, Freddy has a backup controller, and poor Spence is manipulated by Freddy, falling straight into hell to meet Satan. Maggie witnesses the terrifying scene and quickly wakes up Tracy, allowing her to escape from Freddy's nightmare. However, John remains trapped in the dream, unable to wake up. Maggie and Tracy are forced to leave with John's body. In the nightmare, Freddy reveals the truth to the cornered John. It turns out John is not Freddy's child, and his escape from Springwood was orchestrated to lure Maggie back, who is Freddy's daughter instead. It's also revealed that Freddy could only escape Springwood's boundaries and spread his nightmares farther by taking advantage of his own bloodline. After killing John, Freddy possesses Maggie's body, allowing him to leave Springwood that way. When Maggie and Tracy return to the correction center, they discover something strange. The staff there does not recognize the deceased Carlos, Spence, or John, as if they never existed. Only the nightmare doctor remains unaffected. He deduces that Freddy's influence went far beyond Elm Street and reached the center as Maggie and Tracy left Springwood. Suspicious about her own background, Maggie searches her parents' house for clues and finds an adoption certificate, confirming that Freddy is indeed her biological father. In disbelief, Maggie returns to the correction center and goes to sleep, where Freddy appears in her dream, acknowledging her as his daughter. He boasts about successfully spreading his nightmares out of Elm Street with her help, with every city for him to prey upon. Maggie wakes up in a panic, realizing that Tracy is Freddy's next target. As expected, Freddy brings Tracy into a nightmare, where she relives the painful memories of her father's abuse, intending to destroy her mind. However, Tracy has grown stronger and fights back, using a kettle to beat Freddy and escape the dream through the pain of her burns. Frustrated, Freddy turns to Doctor, who however attacks Freddy with a baseball bat. But Freddy, relying on his immortal status within the dream, rises again. He tells Doctor that the demon who granted him the power to kill in dreams promised he could never die while in a dream. Suddenly, Doctor tears off a piece of his sweater and, with the help of an alarm clock he set, successfully escapes the nightmare in time. It turns out that this was his plan all along. He intentionally baited Freddy into revealing the information that Freddy cannot die in dreams. By pulling off a piece of Freddy's sweater, he confirms his suspicion that Freddy can be dragged into reality. Therefore, they understood that they must pull Freddy into the real world and kill him there. The task falls on Maggie. This time, in her dream, she witnesses Freddy's life story. As a child, Freddy is called the son of maniacs due to his background, suffering discrimination and isolation, which makes him cold-blooded and prone to killing animals at his young age. As a teenager, Freddy is obsessed with pain, often engaging in self-harm and killing his abusive foster father, embarking on a life of crime. When Freddy is surrounded by angry parents from Elm Street and about to be burned alive, an ancient dream demon grants him the power to kill in dreams, turning him into a nightmare killer. Maggie finally recalls her memory. It turns out that her mother discovered Freddy's crimes and was killed by him. The young Maggie witnessed the scene, leaving her with a trauma. Furious, Maggie confronts Freddy in the nightmare and drags him out of the dream. However, the cunning Freddy teleports himself to another room just as he is pulled out, evading the ambush set by Tracy and Doctor. The three of them arm themselves with an arsenal of weapons from the basement, determined to end the nightmare of Freddy once and for all. After choosing their weapons, they split up to search for the hiding Freddy. Maggie quickly finds her father, who attempts to deceive and attack her by pretending to be a helpless woman. Unfazed, Maggie knocks Freddy down with a blow and disarms his glove. As Doctor and Tracy arrive, Freddy locks the door and chokes Maggie. Maggie tackles him and breaks his hand. After a struggle, Freddy retrieves his glove, but Maggie, armed with weapons passed on by Doctor and Tracy, manages to subdue him. With his powers diminished in the real world, the defeated Freddy is left helpless. Maggie takes a bomb thrown to her, inserts it into Freddy's body, and taunts him with a kiss, saying, "Happy Father's Day." Thanks to that, the nightmare killer is blown to onion pieces in the real world, where he had no power to revive himself. A Nightmare on Elm Street, Part 7, New Nightmare. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. The movie begins with a shot of a finely crafted metal claw for the nightmare killer Freddy. Heather, who played the protagonist Nancy in the previous episodes, was also present. She shot to fame 10 years prior due to her role in the film. Now a recognized star, she's married to the set's prop master, and they have an adorable son named Dylan. Now she brought her son to the set for a visit. Just as everything seemed calm, the metal claw on the table suddenly gained a consciousness of its own. It went on a killing spree on the set, resulting in the death of 2 crew members and chaos ensued. In the midst of the confusion, Dylan mysteriously vanished right in front of Heather. The terrifying claw set its sights on Heather's husband, lunging towards his face. Heather woke up from her scream, realizing that it was all a nightmare. Upon waking up, she found an earthquake happening outside. She and her husband rushed to their son's room to protect Dylan. Luckily, the earthquake stopped quickly, causing no casualties. They cleaned up their disordered house and prepared to go to work. The husband was heading to another set to make props, while Heather was going to a TV station to participate in an interview celebrating the 10th anniversary of Nightmare on Elm Street. From the couple's conversation, we learn that Heather has been receiving prank calls from someone impersonating Freddy. Despite the troubles, the couple shared an affectionate moment before the husband left for work. After Heather waits for their nanny to arrive, she quickly gives her some instructions before rushing off to participate in the interview program. At the talk show, the host brought up the fans' hopes for Heather to return to the Nightmare on Elm Street crew for the latest sequel. Heather expressed her current desire to spend more time with her family and is not ready to return to the limelight. As the show drew to a close, Robert, the actor who played Freddy, appeared as a surprise guest, setting off a wave of excitement among the audience. Despite Heather knowing this was just an impersonation of Freddy, it stirred uneasiness in her, thinking of her recent nightmares. After the interview, the 2 old friends chatted about their recent lives. Robert mentioned that the movie company indeed had plans for the 2 of them to work together again on a Nightmare on Elm Street sequel. Shortly after their conversation, Heather received an invitation from the movie company's CEO. When they met, the CEO told Heather that the director and screenwriter of the Nightmare on Elm Street series had been having constant nightmares recently, which had inspired him to write a new script. Everyone was hoping she would return to the cast for the latest sequel. Heather, still prioritizing her family, declined his offer. However, the CEO told Heather that her husband had already joined the crew and was involved in creating Freddy's steel claws. This brought back memories of her own nightmares. In the ensuing conversation, Heather discovered that the time when the director started having nightmares almost exactly coincided with her own. What's more, the CEO also received harassing phone calls from someone pretending to be Freddy. All of this made Heather feel that her nightmares were not as simple as she had thought. A worried Heather came home, only to discover that her son was also being plagued by nightmares. He seemed possessed, singing that famous Freddy rhyme. Dylan told her that the dinosaur toy he saw as a protector was mysteriously scratched, leaving 3 claw marks. Sensing that something was off, Heather called her husband, explaining the strange events happening to Dylan, and asked him to come home to care for their son. The husband dropped his work and drove home. But what no one noticed was the Freddy claw he had made had mysteriously vanished. The husband had a 4-hour drive home from the set. Heather had no choice but to put Dylan to bed first. She told him the story of Hansel and Gretel, and they discussed the part where the siblings used breadcrumbs as markers to find their way home. Meanwhile, on his way home, the husband was attacked by Freddy's ghostly claw, causing a serious car accident as he was gutted. Heather witnessed this scene in her nightmare. When she woke up, she learned of her husband's death from the police. Just like the Nightmare on Elm Street movie she starred in, everything from the nightmare had become reality. Heather's husband's death was ruled as due to fatigue driving. At the funeral, Heather hallucinated again. She saw Freddy coming out of the coffin and taking Dylan. Her colleague John woke her up from the hallucination. He was the actor who played the role of Nancy's sheriff father in the Nightmare movie. At night in bed, Dylan started singing Freddy's nursery rhymes as if possessed. Concerned, Heather had no choice but to sleep with him. The next day, Heather discussed the strange happenings with her co-worker John. She thought her family might have a hidden history of mental illness that was passed on to Dylan. John reassured her, saying that Dylan's unusual behavior was only temporary, a result of his father's passing, and that he would recover in due course. While they were talking, Dylan managed to climb to the top of a playground structure. Suddenly, he slipped and fell, but luckily, Heather sprinted like an Olympian and caught Dylan in time, thus averting a disaster. Struggling with these events, Heather called her old friend Robert and vented about her recent misfortunes. She also asked about the progress of the screenplay. Robert told her that the movie script coincidentally included the scene where Dylan climbed the playground facility and fell. This revelation gave Heather goosebumps. Unknown to her, the actor who played Freddy was also tormented by nightmares of Freddy recently. He unconsciously sketched terrifying images of Freddy. Dylan's condition worsened. He began to convulse and foam at the mouth. Heather rushed him to the hospital, but the doctors couldn't determine a clear cause. They decided to admit Dylan for observation. Recalling the recent series of strange events and for her son's safety, Heather decided to seek out the director for help because he was the one person she believed could help. Upon meeting, he revealed to Heather some truths beyond the screenplay. Apparently, throughout human history, there have been legends of a dream demon. This demon, appearing in different forms across the world and across ages, did mercilessly kill people. The dream demon was incredibly powerful and could not be destroyed. However, compelling stories could serve as shackles to confine it. The character of Freddy from the Nightmare on Elm Street series was its most recent shackle. But for the sake of profit, the film company kept remaking the series over the past decade, which resulted in the story becoming dull and boring. This weakened the shackles, allowing the dream demon to wreak havoc in the human world using Freddy's image. Now Heather was the last guardian of these shackles. If the dream demon killed her, it would regain its freedom. The solution the director offered was to shoot another exciting sequel to Nightmare on Elm Street to seal the dream demon again. Although this sounded extremely bizarre, given all the strange things that had happened recently, Heather believed him. She agreed to participate in the latest sequel of Nightmare on Elm Street. The director also promised to complete the screenplay as soon as possible so that the film production could start. But Freddy seemed to have no intention of giving them a breather. The day Heather returned home, she learned from the news that 2 of her husband's colleagues had also died for unknown reasons, just like the dream she had at the beginning of the movie. A sudden earthquake and blackout occurred, and in the ensuing chaos, Heather waited for the quake to end before going to pick up the coffee machine that had fallen on the floor. Suddenly, the real nightmare killer, Freddy, sprang out from the wardrobe and attacked her. Freddy called Heather Nancy, and their fight was interrupted by another earthquake. Heather temporarily evaded Freddy's pursuit, but her arm was left with claw marks. She thought that Freddy would surely go after her son next, so she immediately went to the hospital. There, she met the nanny. It turned out that the nanny had also seen Dylan being attacked in her nightmare, so she rushed to the hospital to visit. They saw Dylan safe and sound, but the nanny noticed that Heather had a streak of white hair, the same look as Nancy's in Elm Street. The attending physician noticed Heather's wounds and took her to be bandaged. Heather told the doctor she was injured in the earthquake, but the doctor was surprised as there was no seismic activity recorded. Heather had another nightmare, causing a great disturbance. The doctor suspected she had a mental disorder and had security take her to another room for testing. Before leaving, Heather pleaded with the nanny not to let her son fall asleep, but under the doctor's orders, 2 nurses took advantage of the nanny's inattention and injected Dylan with a sedative, unknowingly delivering him right into Freddy's claws. A sleepy Dylan became the key for Freddy to enter the real world. Upon arriving, Freddy peeled and killed the nanny right in front of everyone. In the ensuing chaos, a frightened Dylan took the opportunity to escape the hospital. Heather realized he must have gone home to find his guardian dinosaur toy. While driving and making a call to John for help, she found her son on the highway, about to cross the road to get home, with Freddy's steel claw swinging him back and forth. In her frantic efforts to catch up with her son, Heather cursed at Freddy, who taunted her to come at him. While crossing the road, she was hit by a speeding car and fell to the ground. Despite the pain, Heather managed to get home, just in time to meet John, who had come to assist. John calmed her down using his words, but not muscles, assuring her that Dylan was safe and unhurt. But then he pulled Heather aside with a strange look on his face. Incredibly, he addressed Heather as Nancy and thought Dylan was his grandson. What's stranger, John had changed his outfit and was now wearing a badge and a handgun, just like his character, a sheriff in Nightmare movie. Heather's outfit had also transformed into Nancy's from the movie. It was at this point that Heather realized Freddy had blurred the lines between reality and the nightmare story. After bidding John farewell, she went back into the house, only to find Dylan had disappeared again. Despite being unplugged, the TV was spontaneously playing the first Nightmare on Elm Street film. It was at the classic scene where Nancy was preparing to catch Freddy in her dream. Upon calming down, Heather found the sleeping pills that her son had left in the house. She remembered a story they had discussed earlier about using breadcrumbs as trail markers in the tale of Hansel and Gretel. So following the trail of the sleeping pills, Heather arrived at Dylan's room. The dinosaur toy Dylan had used as a protector was completely torn apart by Freddy. It appeared that Dylan had been taken by Freddy. Recalling the scene she had just seen on the TV, Heather understood that Freddy was luring her into the dream world. In order to rescue her son, she swallowed a substantial dose of the sleeping pills. She discovered that the space under the covers had become a passage to the dream world. She followed this passage, leading her straight into Freddy's nightmarish castle. Here, Heather discovered the director's script. She was taken aback to find that all her actions were unfolding according to the script. However, the director had not yet written the ending. It was now up to Heather to strive for a happy ending. Suddenly, Dylan ran out from behind, startling Heather so much she almost hurt him. Mother and son exchanged information. Heather learned that Freddy deliberately let Dylan go to find her. Before Heather could catch her breath, Freddy attacked her from behind. Just as Freddy was about to strike her, Dylan picked up a kitchen knife that had fallen on the ground and stabbed it into Freddy's knee. An angered Freddy knocked Heather out and threw her sexy body into the water, then turned to pursue Dylan. Dylan hid in the fireplace. But Freddy, leveraging his dream powers, transformed into Luffy with his elongated arms and grabbed him, opening his mouth wide to swallow him whole, including his smelly part. Just then, Heather regained consciousness, rushed over, and stabbed a knife into Freddy's buttocks. Freddy experienced excruciating pain and let go of Dylan. He then extended his long, snaky tongue to strangle Heather for massage. Seeing a snake nearby, Dylan used his dagger to play a game of whack-a-mole and then stabbed Freddy's tongue, making it torn in half like a snake's tongue. While Freddy was in pain, the two of them pushed him in and turned up the heat. Freddy revealed his demonic form in the fire, causing the nightmare world to collapse. Heather and Dylan escaped the crumbling dream world just before it exploded. The movie ends with Heather in her son's room, reading him the movie script. The nightmare killer was once again sealed in the story of Elm Street. A Nightmare on Elm Street. Spoilers ahead. Watch out and take care. The movie begins on a rainy night on Elm Street, where the Springwood Diner seemed particularly desolate, with only one customer inside, whose name is Russell. Russell called out to the approaching waitress, asking her to refill his coffee cup, but no matter how loud he shouted, the waitress acted as if she hadn't heard and disappeared behind the bar. Puzzled, Russell happened to go into the kitchen, where a fire suddenly broke out on the counter. The disgusting ingredients made him even more agitated. Just as he was about to leave, a set of steel claws reached out from behind and closed in step by step, suddenly pouncing on Russell. Fortunately, Nancy, who was working part-time as a waitress here, woke him up in time. However, his hand had real wounds, indicating that this was not just a nightmare. At this time, another customer named Chris arrived at the Springwood Diner and saw Russell's injured hand. Russell told her that he hadn't slept for 3 days and had been having nightmares because of childhood trauma. Both of them panicked. Accidentally, Russell spilled coffee on Chris's clothes, so she went to the restroom to clean up. Russell was exhausted and closed his eyes, but nightmare killer Freddy immediately appeared to flex his monstrous muscles, picking up a knife to kill Russell. Chris rushed back to see Russell shouting in his sleep before the knife stabbed him in the neck. At the funeral, Chris cried with sorrow. In her sleep, a young Chris was attacked by the same nightmare killer. Upon waking up, she discovered that she and Russell were actually kindergarten classmates. Chris believed that Russell didn't end his own life, but got killed. At this point, Nancy approached and said she believed Chris's judgment, but she was soon stopped by a boy named Jesse, who had some hormone crush on Chris. That night, Nancy took a sip of water and was about to fall asleep when Freddy crawled out from within the wall, deliberately scaring Nancy to pee her pants. Startled awake, Nancy looked at the water glass she had just used. The droplet was still in its original position, as if time hadn't passed. Afterward, Chris asked her mother for more of her childhood photos to look for clues, but her mother brushed her off. That night, she went up to the attic and found all of her childhood belongings. Freddy suddenly appeared and overpowered her, asking if she remembered him, but she screamed and woke up from the nightmare. The next day in class, Chris's textbook suddenly showed images of the nightmare killer. She realized she was dreaming, but couldn't wake herself up. Freddy, in his own way, taught her not to sleep during class. Chris screamed and woke up in the classroom. She didn't know why the hideous man wanted to kill her, and the strand of hair in front of her only confirmed that what happened in the dream could really happen. After Chris returned home, her flight attendant mother left for a flight, leaving Chris alone at night. Jesse climbed through the window to confess his love, and during their conversation, they found out that Jesse also had been haunted by the same nightmare killer, Freddy. Chris was afraid to sleep alone, so Jesse decided to comfort her in bed, using his ghost-proof muscles. In the middle of the night, Freddy came to find Chris and apologized, saying he had only touched her dog, which then died. Chris screamed and ran back to her room, but ended up in a kindergarten. Freddy was playing hide and seek with the children there. A young Chris pulled a girl and told her to hide quickly. Suddenly, Jesse beside her turned into Freddy, pounced on Chris, and performed an aerial stunt with Chris. Then, he showed off his steel claws and pierced Chris's stomach. Blood splattered on Jesse. Jesse rushed into Nancy's house, telling her that Chris was killed in her sleep and that as long as they didn't sleep, they wouldn't be killed by Freddy. In the end, Jesse was arrested as a criminal by the police. In jail, Jesse still forced himself to stay awake, enduring the night. However, on the second day, he entered Freddy's dream world. He found himself in a boiler room with Freddy appearing and chasing him. As he ran away, he saw the gruesome corpses of Russell and Chris. Jesse broke down. Suddenly, a steel claw pierced his chest, and in reality, Jess collapsed in the prison cell. Meanwhile, Nancy's best friend, Smith, was searching for drugs that could deprive sleep in the library. Suddenly, everyone around him disappeared, and a little girl appeared at the end of the room. He stood up and searched for the little girl, faintly hearing the sound of a class. He saw a man in a red and green sweater there, seemingly teaching children. Just as he was about to see the man's face, a hand appeared behind him, but it turned out it was Nancy. So he told Nancy that people who don't sleep for long periods of time can experience microsleeps, meaning they wouldn't even notice when they were dreaming, even when they were awake. This statement filled Nancy with fear. That night, Nancy kept drawing to force herself not to sleep. She asked her mother if there was any connection between her and Chris, Jesse, and Russell, but her mother evaded the question as if hiding something. Later, Nancy took a bath, intending to take a rest. She couldn't help but close her eyes. However, Freddy quietly extended his steel claws from the water, wanting to give her some massage using his claws. After her bath, Nancy found her bedroom had turned into a snowy landscape. Barefoot, she stepped onto the snow and walked towards Freddy's dream world. She arrived at a school called Badham Preschool. Suddenly, Freddy appeared, affectionately calling her Little Nancy, all grown up. He then cornered her, affectionately kissing and caressing her. At that moment, Smith called and told Nancy the news of Jess's death in his sleep. Terrified, Nancy said she had a nightmare and saw Freddy. Smith quickly took a pill to deprive sleep and rushed to Nancy's house. Nancy believed her mother must be hiding something from them, so they searched the house and accidentally found a preschool graduation photo with Chris, Jesse, Russell, Smith, and Nancy all in it. It turned out they were classmates in preschool. Nancy's mother appeared, and Nancy confronted her about the lies. The mother and daughter argued fiercely, and finally, her mother revealed the memories she wanted Nancy to forget forever. In the preschool where Nancy and her friends attended, there was a gardener named Freddy Krueger who lived in the basement. He often played games with the children, and Nancy was his favorite. Gradually, parents noticed that their children always had injuries. The children claimed that Freddy would often take them to a secret cave. Before the parents could report him to the police for the abuse, Freddy escaped from Springwood. Still, Nancy remained skeptical about her mother's story and decided to find all the children shown in the photo. Afterward, Smith was taking a swimming class. As he swam freestyle in the pool, he found himself in an abandoned factory. He saw a creepy man being chased, who hid in a warehouse. A group of parents armed with tools got out of a car, claiming they wanted revenge for their children. One of the parents, Smith's father, angrily poured gasoline and set the warehouse on fire, determined to send the man straight to meet Satan in hell. The man took off his coat, revealing a red and green sweater. It turned out that Smith had entered Freddy's memories from when he was alive. Freddy charged at Smith in freestyle, who was scared to shit his swimming pants. In reality, Smith spat out some water and immediately woke up. He confronted his father, asking why they didn't call the police instead of taking matters into their own hands, and claimed that they killed Freddy based on a child's words. He then stormed out, and Nancy hurriedly followed him. After that, she saw Chris lying in a body bag, inviting her to play. Smith told her it was just a hallucination, and they went to find Badham Preschool. Smith got out of the car to buy medication, but the doctor refused to give it to him due to his disoriented state. Outside, Nancy experienced microsleep, and Freddy rushed into the car, dragging her out. Nancy woke up and burned herself with a car cigarette lighter. Smith didn't return, so she went into the drugstore to find him. As soon as she entered, the lights flickered, and she found herself in the boiler room. Freddy approached, and Nancy fell, tearing his sweater. During the struggle, Freddy's steel claws injured Nancy, indicating she had entered another microsleep. The line between reality and dreams was becoming blurred, and the torn piece of sweater suggested that they might be able to bring Freddy out of the dream world. Later on, Smith took Nancy to the hospital, where he searched a nurse's cart for medication that could keep them awake. He quietly took a syringe of adrenaline. In the operating room, the doctor prepared to give Nancy painkillers, but his hand transformed into steel claws. Nancy panicked in her bed, and her mother was called away. Her mother signed a consent form for a sedative, but luckily, Smith secretly took Nancy out of the hospital. On the road, Smith couldn't bear the exhaustion and injected himself with the adrenaline he took from the hospital. Afterward, Smith expressed his feelings to Nancy. As soon as he finished speaking, Freddy appeared in the middle of the road, and their car crashed into a roadside barrier, forcing them to continue on foot. Behind them, they could faintly hear Freddy's laughter. They finally found the preschool and went down to the basement, which seemed to be where Freddy had lived. They discovered a hidden room behind a wall, and Nancy recalled that she had been there when she was young. Smith found a photo of young Nancy being abused. She snatched the photo and realized the truth. Freddy had killed Chris and the others because they had spoken out about what happened. Nancy decided to sleep and pull Freddy out of the dream world, with Smith on watch to wake her up. However, as soon as Nancy closed her eyes, Smith was taken into the dream world by Freddy first. Freddy viciously attacked Smith and told him he couldn't save Nancy. Just then, Nancy's voice came through, and Smith struggled on the ground. Freddy taunted Nancy, asking if she had come to play a game with him, and suggested they go on a date. Nancy hid her body in a closet, but her smell betrayed her. As a result, Freddy appeared right next to her. Nancy screamed like a chicken and burst out, only to find herself in a pool of blood plasma. She swam desperately while Freddy laughed, asking how she liked being wet. Slowly, Nancy was submerged in the blood pool and fell from the ceiling. Freddy had dressed Nancy in his favorite dress, and she was restrained in a bed, unable to move. Freddy teased and threatened her, throwing her out of the bed like an adult toy. Nancy grabbed a pair of scissors and stabbed him in the eye, but it didn't hurt him at all. She was thrown back onto the bed and screamed in a chicken voice for Smith to wake her up. Smith returned to reality because of the adrenaline injection and called out to Nancy, struggling to stay awake. Freddy declared himself to be Nancy's boyfriend, and his steel claws slowly extended toward her, possibly to do some Thailand-style massage on her. In reality, Smith took out the syringe and stabbed it into Nancy simultaneously. Nancy woke up in pain, and they managed to pull Freddy out of the dream world. Together, they wrestled muscles with Freddy in bare hands, but still found themselves outmatched. At the time, Smith grabbed a knife and stabbed it into the back of Freddy's knee. Enraged, Freddy was about to execute Smith when his steel claw hand was severed. Smith gave him another slash, causing Freddy's neck to be severed as well. After that, the two set fire to the secret room, seemingly ending it all. However, when Nancy returned home, Freddy appeared in the mirror to flex his ugly figure again. Then, his steel claws pierced her mother's head and dragged her into the mirror, where she could also serve as a flight attendant. This is Daniel CC Movie Channel. Stay safe and enjoy your day.